At first glance, the neighborhood of Willow Creek looked like something out of a glossy real estate magazine. Perfectly trimmed hedges lined the sidewalks, mailboxes gleamed with fresh coats of paint, and rows of pastel-painted houses stood in quiet formation as if competing to outshine one another. The lawns were green year-round, fertilized and manicured under the watchful eye of the local homeowners association. To an outsider, it looked like a suburban paradise, safe, clean, and orderly. But beneath that polished surface, tension simmered, waiting for the right spark to ignite chaos. At the heart of it all was the HOA president, a woman named Margaret, though most neighbors had taken to calling her simply Karen behind her back. She thrived on control, striding through the neighborhood with a clipboard in hand, issuing violation notices for the smallest infractions. A garden gnome deemed non-compliant, a mailbox painted the wrong shade of white, even children's bicycles left near driveways drew her wrath. For Karen, rules weren't just guidelines, they were weapons she wielded to maintain her authority. For years, residents had grumbled but complied. Few dared to challenge the HOA board, and even fewer dared to go against Karen herself. Her influence stretched into every corner of the community. She selected who joined the board, decided which improvements got funded, and ensured that her voice was the loudest at every meeting. In her mind, she wasn't just enforcing the rules, she was preserving the prestige of Willow Creek. But that illusion of order began to crumble the day a new homeowner moved in. James Whitaker was a retired Army veteran who had served more than 2 decades overseas. After years of renting apartments and temporary housing, he finally decided to settle down in Willow Creek. Drawn by the quiet streets and the promise of a peaceful retirement, he bought a modest 2-story house on the corner lot. With a wide front porch and enough backyard space for a vegetable garden, James imagined this would be his sanctuary, a place to relax and enjoy life after service. What he didn't know was that Karen had already marked him as a target. On his very first week, James installed an American flagpole in his front yard. For him, it was more than decoration, it was a symbol of his life, his service, and his pride. But to Karen, it was an eyesore, taller than the approved height limit she had drafted into the HOA guidelines years earlier. Within days, James received his first violation notice, demanding he remove the flagpole or face escalating fines. At first, he ignored it, believing it must have been a mistake. Surely no one would object to a simple flagpole. But Karen was relentless. She followed up with letters, threats of daily fines, and even a warning that non-compliance could lead to property liens. Neighbors watched uneasily as the situation escalated. Many whispered their support for James, but fear of retaliation kept them silent. James had faced adversaries before, enemy combatants, harsh terrains, impossible missions. Yet here, in his own neighborhood, he found himself fighting a different kind of battle. Karen wasn't just enforcing rules, she was testing how far she could push him, how much control she could exert. The board backed her every step of the way, either too loyal or too intimidated to resist. Meetings became a stage where Karen paraded her authority, reading out James's infractions with smug satisfaction. She painted him as a rebel neighbor who endangered the harmony of Willow Creek. Every violation, every supposed misstep, became fuel for her crusade. But James wasn't the type to back down. Instead of tearing down his flagpole, he reinforced it, making sure it was sturdy enough to withstand storms. When Karen tried to fine him, he documented every letter, every notice, and every attempt at intimidation. Quietly, he began building a case of his own. As weeks turned into months, the standoff grew uglier. Karen, emboldened by the silence of the other residents, escalated her efforts. She hired private inspectors to scrutinize James's property, citing him for trivial issues: grass blades an inch too tall, a garden hose left uncoiled, a shed supposedly not painted in regulation colors. The fines stacked higher, and her tone grew harsher. Neighbors began to notice something unsettling. This wasn't about a flagpole anymore. It was about power. Karen had chosen James as her battleground, determined to make an example of him so that no one else would ever dare to resist. Yet James's calm defiance unsettled her. No matter how many notices she sent, he didn't flinch. No matter how many threats she issued, he didn't remove the flag. His quiet strength infuriated her more than outright rebellion ever could. The tipping point came when Karen decided to go further than anyone had expected. At the next board meeting, she pushed through a motion to place a lien on James's property for unpaid fines. With enough signatures from the compliant board members, she declared that the HOA had the authority to seize his home if he didn't pay up. In her eyes, this was victory. She had cornered him, stripped him of options, and proven once again that she was untouchable. But in her arrogance, Karen had overlooked one thing James had been preparing all along. As news of the lien spread through the neighborhood, whispers turned into open outrage. Residents who had long resented Karen's tactics began to rally behind James. They saw in him a man unwilling to bend to tyranny, a man standing up not just for himself, but for every homeowner who had ever been bullied into silence. James remained composed. While Karen celebrated her supposed triumph, he was already in contact with local authorities, attorneys, and even the media. He knew that the HOA had crossed a line, and once outside eyes were on the situation, their unchecked power would no longer go unquestioned. The stage was set. Willow Creek, once the picture of suburban perfection, was now divided between those who feared Karen and those who had finally found the courage to resist her. The flagpole in James's yard became more than a symbol of his service. It became a banner of defiance, a rallying point for neighbors who were tired of living under Karen's rule. And as the tension reached its peak, no one in Willow Creek could have predicted the storm that was about to break. Because the moment Karen thought she had won, the one thing she never expected was about to arrive: the police. Karen strutted through the neighborhood like a queen returning from conquest. With the lien now filed against James's property, she believed the battle was over. To her, the paperwork wasn't just a legal maneuver, it was her trophy, proof that no one, not even a decorated veteran, could resist her authority. She carried herself with an air of triumph, waving her clipboard like a scepter. Neighbors, however, didn't see victory in her stride. They saw arrogance. They saw a woman so blinded by control that she had forgotten the community she claimed to protect. For years, they had tolerated her petty rules and suffocating fines. But this, taking a man's home for, refusing to remove a flagpole, that was a line too far. Behind closed doors, conversations began to stir. Families whispered at dinner tables, quietly agreeing that enough was enough. Retired couples muttered on their porches, watching Karen march by with disgust. Parents who once avoided HOA meetings now considered attending, if only to stand against her. For the first time, Karen's power wasn't inspiring fear, it was inspiring rebellion. James, meanwhile, remained calm. On the outside, his life carried on as if nothing had changed. He mowed his lawn, waved politely to neighbors, and tended to his garden. But inside, he was meticulously preparing. Every letter from the HOA, every notice, every violation, was neatly filed and ready to be presented as evidence. He had spoken with an attorney who specialized in HOA disputes, and the man assured him that the HOA's actions were not only heavy-handed but potentially illegal. Karen didn't see the trap she had set for herself. She only saw the narrative she had built in her own mind, a stubborn neighbor finally crushed under the weight of her authority. She fantasized about the day James would be forced to pack his belongings and leave. His flagpole torn down, his pride shattered. She thought the sight of his removal would serve as a warning to others that no one challenged her, and got away with it. But Karen had underestimated the very community she ruled over. When word spread that the HOA intended to seize James's property, more neighbors rallied to his side. Some offered to testify on his behalf, recalling times when Karen had harassed them with unfair fines or targeted them for trivial reasons. Others began organizing informal meetings in living rooms and garages, away from Karen's watchful eyes, discussing how they might finally vote her out. The neighborhood was changing. The fear that had once kept everyone silent was fading, replaced by simmering anger and a hunger for justice. James had become more than just a neighbor under attack, he had become a symbol of resistance. Karen, oblivious to the growing unrest, doubled down. She issued new rounds of violation notices, targeting not only James, but also anyone she suspected of siding with him. Trash cans not pulled in fast enough, holiday decorations left up a day too long, lawn furniture deemed unapproved. Nothing escaped her wrath. It was her way of reminding the neighborhood who was in charge, But instead of cowering, residents grew bolder. Some openly defied her notices, refusing to pay fines. Others stopped attending HOA meetings altogether. Dismissing her authority, the tighter Karen tried to grip the community, the more it slipped through her fingers. The breaking point came one Friday afternoon. Karen, feeling untouchable, arranged for a private towing company to remove James's truck from his driveway, claiming it violated aesthetic guidelines for not being parked at the precise angle dictated in the handbook. Neighbors gathered as the tow truck backed into James's property, chains rattling and engines roaring. James stood silently on his porch, arms crossed, watching. He didn't protest, didn't shout. Instead, he calmly filmed the entire ordeal, documenting every detail. The crowd of neighbors erupted in outrage, shouting at the tow truck operator, demanding to know who had authorized the act. Karen appeared at the end of the street, clipboard in hand, smirking as if she had finally broken him. But the scene didn't play out the way she had imagined. Instead of humiliation, James gained sympathy. Neighbors who had remained neutral could no longer ignore what they had witnessed. A man's vehicle had been forcibly taken from his own driveway, not by city officials or law enforcement, but by the whim of an HOA president. By the time the tow truck disappeared down the road, whispers of illegal and abusive power were rippling through the crowd. People pulled out their phones, recording videos, calling friends, and sharing what they had just seen. Karen had tried to demonstrate her dominance, but in doing so, she had exposed herself to the entire neighborhood. That night, James made his move. With his attorney's guidance, he filed an official complaint with the county sheriff's office, detailing not only the wrongful lien, but also the unlawful towing of his vehicle. He included every notice, every letter, every recording, and every witness statement he had gathered. His case was airtight, a mountain of evidence showing a pattern of harassment and abuse of power. The sheriff's office took the complaint seriously. HOA disputes were common, but this one reeked of overreach, threatening to seize a veteran's home over a flagpole, authorizing private property seizures without legal backing. These weren't simple neighborhood squabbles anymore, they were potential crimes. When the knock came on Karen's door the following week, she wasn't prepared. Two uniformed officers stood on her porch, their presence impossible to ignore. The neighborhood watched from windows and lawns as Karen, usually so smug and commanding, froze at the sight of the badges. The officers explained they needed to speak with her about multiple complaints filed against her leadership of the HOA. For the first time in years, Karen wasn't in control. Her words, her clipboard, her authority, they meant nothing to the police. Neighbors watched in silence as she stammered, her face pale, her voice cracking. The woman who had ruled Willow Creek with an iron grip was suddenly reduced to just another resident under investigation. James didn't need to gloat. He didn't need to speak. As the officers continued their questioning, he simply stood in his yard, the flag above him waving proudly in the breeze. The neighborhood, once cowed by Karen's intimidation, now looked to him as proof that even the most powerful tyrant could fall. But this was only the beginning. The police presence signaled a shift, but it didn't end the conflict. Karen wasn't done yet, and neither was James, because when pride and power are at stake, even the most obvious defeat can turn into the start of a deeper, nastier battle. The presence of police in Willow Creek marked a turning point that no one could ignore. For years, Karen had operated unchecked, her authority so absolute that few dared even whisper against her. But when neighbors watched uniformed officers questioning her on her own porch, the illusion of her invincibility shattered. Suddenly, people realized Karen could be challenged, and more importantly, she could lose. The news spread like wildfire. Families texted each other late into the night, recounting every detail they had seen. The HOA president, the untouchable queen of the community, reduced to stammering under the watchful eyes of law enforcement. For many, it was the first spark of hope in years, but for others, it was the beginning of fear. Willow Creek quickly split into two camps. On one side stood those who had suffered quietly under Karen's rule and were ready to rally behind James. On the other side were Karen's loyalists, board members, personal allies, and neighbors too dependent on her influence to risk speaking out. The once peaceful neighborhood became a battleground of whispered conversations, subtle glares, and divided loyalties. Karen herself tried to downplay the incident. She marched to the next HOA meeting with her usual bravado, insisting the police visit had been a misunderstanding. She told the board that James was exaggerating, twisting facts, and misleading the community to turn them against her. She painted herself as the victim, a woman unfairly targeted for simply enforcing the rules. But the cracks in her image were visible. For the first time, some board members hesitated before nodding in agreement. A few even avoided her gaze, shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Karen's speeches, once met with unquestioned approval, now rang hollow. Meanwhile, James never once raised his voice or tried to outshine Karen publicly. Instead, he let the evidence and the truth speak for him. Neighbors who once avoided him now stopped by his yard to quietly thank him, offering support in ways both big and small. A pie left on his porch, a lawnmower shared, a whispered promise to testify, if needed. But Karen wasn't about to let her grip slip without a fight. She began spreading rumors, whispering that James had a history of trouble, that his military record wasn't as honorable as he claimed, that he was a manipulator playing the neighborhood against her. Her words were venom, designed to sow doubt and erode his support. Some believed her, or at least pretended to. Old friendships and alliances complicated the lines being drawn. The Johnsons, who lived 2 houses down from James, sided with Karen, claiming they valued order and didn't want chaos in their community. The Millers, longtime residents who feared retaliation, kept their heads down and avoided involvement entirely. But others were emboldened. The Carters, who had been fined thousands over a shed Karen deemed non-compliant, began openly criticizing her. In meetings, the Ramirez family, whose children had once been scolded for leaving chalk drawings on the sidewalk, proudly displayed their own American flag in solidarity with James. Slowly, Willow Creek was changing. The division became impossible to ignore. HOA meetings turned into shouting matches, with Karen and her loyalists on one side and James's growing supporters on the other. Neighbors who had once exchanged friendly waves across driveways now crossed the street to avoid one another. The board, once united under Karen's rule, fractured into factions, with arguments spilling long into the night. James, though calm and measured, understood the stakes. This wasn't just about a flagpole anymore. It was about power, justice, and the soul of the neighborhood. He had been documenting everything from the start, but now he began preparing for the bigger battle he knew was coming. His attorney was building a case, not just to fight the lien, but to challenge Karen's leadership and expose the HOA's corruption. Karen, feeling the walls close in, turned more desperate. She ordered new inspections across the neighborhood, targeting anyone who showed even the slightest hint of siding with James. Suddenly, violations skyrocketed. People were cited for weeds barely visible in flower beds, basketball hoops on driveways, even the wrong type of mulch in gardens. It was her attempt to remind everyone who was in charge, to crush the rebellion before it gained too much strength. But the tactic backfired. Instead of silencing opposition, it fueled it. Families who had stayed quiet now found themselves in Karen's crosshairs, and they didn't appreciate it. More and more neighbors began to see what James had seen all along. Karen's rules weren't about maintaining the community. They were about feeding her need for control. The tipping point came at a particularly heated HOA meeting. The community center was packed, more residents present than anyone could remember. Tension buzzed through the air like electricity. Karen tried to assert control, banging her gavel and demanding order, but the crowd wasn't listening. One by one, neighbors stood up, voicing their frustrations. They spoke of years of unfair fines, of harassment, of being too afraid to speak out. They recounted stories of humiliation, of money drained, of dreams soured by Karen's obsession with power. And through it all, James sat silently, listening, his presence alone enough to remind everyone why they were speaking up. Karen grew more frantic, her voice rising, her words sharp and defensive. She accused her neighbors of betrayal, of ignorance, of siding with a man she painted as dangerous. But the more she shouted, the more she lost them. Her once commanding presence now looked desperate, unhinged, even pitiful. By the end of the meeting, it was clear the neighborhood was no longer united under her. For the first time, Karen had real opposition, organized and determined. What had started as one man's refusal to back down had grown into a movement. Willow Creek was no longer her unquestioned kingdom, it was a battlefield she was slowly losing. But Karen wasn't finished. Humiliation only hardened her resolve. As she stormed out of the meeting, her face red with fury, she vowed to crush this rebellion once and for all. In her mind, James hadn't just challenged her authority, he had declared war. And if war was what he wanted, war was what he would get. The neighborhood held its breath, knowing the storm was far from over. Because when pride and desperation collide, the battle doesn't end quietly, it escalates. And everyone in Willow Creek was about to be caught in the crossfire. Karen was humiliated, but humiliation only made her more dangerous. The board meeting that had turned against her replayed in her mind like a broken record. Every raised voice, every neighbor who dared to criticize her, every defiant look aimed her way, it all fueled her rage. She had been the queen of Willow Creek for too long to accept defeat. And in her mind, James was the root cause of it all. She convinced herself that if she could crush him completely, the rebellion would die with him. Karen had always believed in setting examples, and James would become the harshest example of all. The very next day, she launched her counterattack. A new wave of violation notices swept across the neighborhood, hitting James with more fines than ever. His lawn height, his trash bins, a supposed unapproved birdhouse. Even the shade of paint on his shutters, though it matched the guidelines perfectly, was cited as a violation. Each letter came certified, signed by Karen herself, her tone colder and more hostile than before. But James wasn't surprised. He had expected her to escalate. Quietly, he added each notice to his growing file, another piece of evidence showing her harassment. He no longer saw these as threats, he saw them as ammunition for the legal battle he knew was coming. Karen wasn't content with paperwork alone. She leveraged every connection she had on the board, rallying her loyalists to approve more aggressive measures. Together, they authorized late fees, additional inspections, and even threatened to cut off access to community amenities for James and anyone suspected of supporting him. The pool, the gym, the community center all suddenly became bargaining chips in Karen's war. But these tactics only deepened the divide in Willow Creek. Neighbors who had once stayed neutral now found themselves caught in the crossfire. Some were suddenly fined for things that had never been issues before, clear retaliation for their sympathy toward James. Families who had never spoken against the HOA found violation letters on their doors. The abuse spread like wildfire, and with every unjust notice, more people joined James's side. What Karen didn't realize was that her campaign of intimidation was isolating her. The very power she relied on, fear, was slipping away. The community no longer respected her rules. They resented them. She was breeding not compliance, but rebellion. Still, Karen pressed on. She saw the growing opposition not as a sign to back down, but as proof of conspiracy. In her mind, James wasn't just one man, he was leading an organized plot to overthrow her authority. And if he was plotting war, she would escalate to total domination. Her next move shocked everyone. Without warning, Karen filed paperwork to initiate foreclosure proceedings against James's home. She claimed his unpaid fines and mounting penalties gave the HOA full legal authority to seize the property. She presented it as a done deal, a formality that would soon see James removed from Willow Creek entirely. The announcement sent shockwaves through the neighborhood. Some were terrified. If Karen could take his home, what was stopping her from taking theirs? Others were enraged, openly accusing her of abuse of power. The board meeting, where she revealed the foreclosure, erupted into chaos. Shouts echoed through the room, neighbors pointing fingers, demanding accountability. But Karen remained smug, convinced she was untouchable. James, however, was ready. His attorney had already prepared for this move. They knew Karen's foreclosure attempt was built on shaky ground, a legal overreach that would collapse under scrutiny. But James didn't reveal his hand just yet. He let her celebrate, let her bask in what she thought was victory, because he understood something Karen never did. Timing was everything. The weeks that followed were the darkest Willow Creek had ever seen. Neighbors turned against neighbors, friendships crumbled, and the once idyllic community became a war zone of suspicion and resentment. Karen's loyalists doubled down, enforcing her rules with renewed vigor, while James's supporters organized in secret, preparing for the day they could finally break free. In the midst of it all, James's flagpole still stood tall, the American flag fluttering defiantly in the wind. To Karen, it was a constant reminder of her failure to bend him. To the community, it had become a symbol of resistance, of courage, of the hope that her reign might finally come to an end. Karen's breaking point came when local media caught wind of the story. A neighborhood HOA threatening to seize the home of a veteran over a flagpole was too outrageous to ignore. A small news crew showed up one morning, cameras rolling as they interviewed James on his porch. He spoke calmly, describing the harassment, the endless fines, and the looming threat of foreclosure. He didn't need anger in his words, the truth was powerful enough. When Karen saw the cameras, she stormed across the street, clipboard in hand, demanding they leave. But the sight of her shouting and flailing on live television didn't strengthen her image, it destroyed it. Viewers at home didn't see a dedicated HOA president protecting her community. They saw the stereotype everyone already feared, the power-hungry Karen, drunk on authority, terrorizing her neighbors. The story spread quickly, shared on social media, drawing outrage from people far beyond Willow Creek. Messages of support poured in for James, while Karen found herself mocked, criticized, and vilified online. Her attempt to project strength had backfired spectacularly. But even then, she refused to concede. Pride blinded her to reality. She insisted the media had twisted the story, that James had manipulated public opinion, that she was still in the right. She clung to her power like a lifeline, unwilling to accept the tide had turned against her. The final straw came when law enforcement returned this time, not just to ask questions. They arrived with documents, investigating not only Karen's treatment of James, but her broader misuse of HOA funds and her abuse of authority. Years of unchecked control had left a paper trail, and now every questionable decision she had ever made was under the microscope. For the first time, Karen's confidence wavered. The smug smile faltered, her hands trembled, and her voice cracked as she tried to insist on her innocence. The neighborhood watched, silent but resolute, as the woman who had ruled them for years began to unravel before their eyes. But this wasn't the end, it was the beginning of the downfall. Because Karen's empire of control wasn't just crumbling, it was about to collapse completely. Karen's reign, once defined by her iron grip on Willow Creek, was now teetering on the edge of ruin. What had begun as whispers of discontent had grown into a roar that could no longer be silenced. The police investigation had ignited something she had never imagined, a united community, one that no longer feared her clipboard, her fines, or her threats. The first crack in her empire came quietly, but it was devastating. A letter from the state's Department of Community Affairs arrived, informing the board that Karen's handling of funds was under review. Years of excessive fines, questionable expenditures, and unauthorized administrative fees had raised red flags. The audit was coming, and with it, the possibility of criminal charges. Word spread quickly. Neighbors who had been too afraid to speak up now shared their stories openly. Couples described how Karen had fined them for leaving children's bikes in their driveways. Elderly residents admitted they had paid compliance fees out of fear of foreclosure. The once private grievances became public confessions, and each one painted Karen not as a protector of the community, but as a predator feeding on it. The board began to fracture. Those who had once stood loyally by her side realized the storm was too great to weather. One by one, they distanced themselves, some resigning outright, others turning on her to save their own reputations. Karen, who had always seen herself as indispensable, now stood increasingly alone. But her pride would not allow her to step back. She doubled down, filing new complaints against James, and even attempting to discredit him in front of the cameras. She accused him of lying, of fabricating his military service, of conspiring with outsiders to destroy Willow Creek. Yet, every accusation fell flat, easily disproven by records, documents, and the simple fact that the community trusted James far more than they trusted her. The moment that truly marked the collapse came at the next board meeting. It was standing room only, with residents packing the community center, their faces hard with determination. Karen walked in, clutching her binder, still clinging to authority. She began the meeting as she always had, gavel in hand, voice sharp and commanding. But instead of silence, She was met with resistance. Neighbors interrupted her, demanded answers, refused to let her dismiss their concerns. When she tried to fine one of them on the spot for disruptive conduct, the crowd erupted in laughter. The fear that had once kept them quiet was gone, replaced by defiance. And then came the motion proposed, seconded, and carried by overwhelming majority, a vote of no confidence in Karen's leadership. Her face turned pale as the ballots were counted. Every hand that went up against her chipped away at the fortress she had built around herself. By the end, she stood stripped of her position. No longer president of the HOA, she had ruled like a dictator. The gavel she once wielded as a weapon was taken from her, and the room thundered with applause as her downfall was sealed. But for Karen, the humiliation didn't end there. The foreclosure attempt against James collapsed completely when the court dismissed it as baseless. Not only did she fail to take his home, but the ruling also opened the door for James to sue for damages, and he did. With his attorney's guidance, he filed a civil suit against Karen and the HOA for harassment, emotional distress, and abuse of authority. The lawsuit dragged everything into the open: emails, meeting notes, financial records. All of it was scrutinized. The evidence of Karen's misconduct was overwhelming. Payments made to companies she secretly owned, expenses justified as community improvements, but spent on personal luxuries, and countless examples of her targeting residents she disliked. The case became more than James versus Karen. It became the community versus corruption. As the trial loomed, Karen's world shrank. Neighbors who once waved politely now crossed the street to avoid her. Friends she had boasted of abandoned her. Even her most loyal supporters, those who had defended her ruthlessly, now sought plea deals or leniency by testifying against her. The isolation gnawed at her, but still, she refused to admit defeat. Meanwhile, James flourished. His resilience had made him a local hero, a symbol of what it meant to stand up against injustice. The flagpole in his yard became a gathering point for neighbors, who often left flowers or small notes of thanks at its base. What Karen had tried to erase had instead become the very heart of the neighborhood's renewal. Then came the day law enforcement returned, not for questions, but with warrants. Boxes of files were removed from Karen's home, computers, binders, even her phone seized as evidence in the growing investigation. The image of officers carrying boxes down her driveway was splashed across the evening news, sealing her public downfall. The empire Karen had built on fear, manipulation, and control was gone. What remained was a shell of a woman, cornered and desperate, her once commanding voice reduced to frantic denials that no one believed anymore. But the story was not finished. The trial was approaching, and with it, the final reckoning. For James, it was the chance to not only clear his name, but to see justice delivered. For Karen, it was the last desperate fight to cling to what little she had left. The community, once divided, now waited together, united by the ordeal. They wanted closure. They wanted accountability. And they knew that the courtroom would deliver what the board meetings never could. A permanent end to Karen's reign. The fall of Karen's empire was complete. But her reckoning was only just beginning. The courtroom was packed. Residents of Willow Creek filled the benches, their eyes fixed on the front where the figures stood as symbols of everything the community had endured. On one side was James, calm and resolute, his attorney beside him. On the other was Karen, her once carefully polished image now frayed, her blazer rumpled, her hands fidgeting with papers she could no longer control. For years, Karen had ruled the neighborhood with unchecked power, her clipboard and threats enough to bend everyone to her will. But now, it was the law that held the power, and for the first time in her life, Karen could not talk over it, fine it, or intimidate it into silence. The trial unfolded like a public unmasking. Witness after witness testified about Karen's abuses, the relentless fines, the threats of foreclosure, the harassment of families who couldn't keep up with her demands. Elderly residents spoke of sleepless nights fearing they would lose their homes. Parents recalled children crying as inspectors photographed their yards, each account chipped away at the last remnants of Karen's authority. Then came the financial records. The paper trail laid barriers of misused funds, money siphoned from HOA dues into accounts connected to Karen, expenses disguised as community improvements, but used for personal luxuries, a patio remodel, vacations, Even designer handbags all paid for under the HOA's budget. The evidence was undeniable. Karen tried to defend herself. She claimed it was all for the good of Willow Creek, that she had acted within her rights as president, that the accusations were part of a conspiracy to destroy her. But the more she spoke, the more hollow her words sounded. The jury didn't see a leader fighting for her community. They saw a woman clinging desperately to the last scraps of power she had left. James's testimony was the turning point. He spoke not with anger, but with quiet conviction. He recounted the endless violation notices, the foreclosure threats, the humiliation of being targeted. For flying the very flag he had served under, his words carried weight, not just because of his service, but because of his unwavering composure in the face of Karen's campaign against him. The courtroom listened in silence, the truth resonating louder than any of Karen's excuses. When closing arguments ended, the jury deliberated for only a short time. The verdict was decisive. Karen was guilty of fraud, harassment, and abuse of power. The court ordered restitution to the victims, removal of all fines issued under her leadership, and penalties that would strip Karen of any authority in community governance for life. She was also sentenced to probation, community service, and a financial settlement that would take years to repay. The sound of the gavel sealing the judgment echoed through the courtroom, like the final crack of thunder in a storm. Karen's empire had not only collapsed, it had been buried. For Willow Creek, it was the dawn of a new chapter. The HOA board was rebuilt with fair and reasonable leadership, guided by transparency and accountability. Neighbors who had once avoided each other out of fear began to reconnect. The community, long divided by Karen's tyranny, slowly healed. As for James, he became more than just the man who stood up to Karen. He became a symbol of resilience. The flagpole in his yard, once a target of Karen's wrath, was now embraced by the neighborhood. On holidays, families gathered there, children playing under the flag, neighbors sharing food and stories. What Karen had tried to tear down had instead become the very heart of the community's unity. Karen, meanwhile, faded into obscurity, stripped of her title, mocked online, and avoided by those she once ruled. She became a cautionary tale. She no longer walked the streets with her clipboard. The sight of her once commanding figure was replaced by whispers of her downfall, a reminder of what happens when power is abused and pride blinds a person to the truth. The story of Willow Creek spread far beyond its borders. Other neighborhoods, other HOA letters took notice. It became a rallying cry for homeowners tired of tyrannical boards and petty enforcements. News articles framed it as a victory of the people over corruption. Online forums shared James's story as proof that standing up, no matter how daunting, could bring change. But for those who lived it, the lesson was even more personal. They had endured fear, division, and the weight of oppression, but they had also discovered strength, unity, and the power of resistance. Karen had thought she could break them, but in trying, she had only made them stronger. On the evening after the verdict, James sat quietly on his porch. The sun dipped low, casting a warm glow over the neighborhood. The flag above him fluttered gently in the breeze. Neighbors stopped by to thank him, to share smiles and laughter that had once felt impossible under Karen's rule. Children played in the street, their carefree laughter filling the air. Willow Creek had been reclaimed not by fear, but by hope. And though Karen had believed she would always win, the truth was undeniable. The day the police arrived, her fate was sealed. Her empire had crumbled, her power destroyed, and her name forever remembered not as a leader, but as the Karen who lost everything. The final chapter of her reign had been written, and this time, it wasn't Karen holding the pen.